It's time for Supply Chain Now. Broadcasting live from the supply chain capital of the country, Atlanta, Georgia. Heard around the world, Supply Chain Now spotlights the best in all things supply chain. The people, the technologies, the best practices, and the critical issues of the day. And now, here are your hosts.
Hey, good morning. Scott Luton and Greg White with you here on Supply Chain Now. Welcome to today's show. Good morning, Greg. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Doing fantastic. This has been an outstanding week. We're really excited about today's conversation. We're going to be talking with a global technology leader that helps provide the market-leading information management solutions in the information age. So we're going to be working hard, Greg, as always, to elevate your supply chain IQ, right?
I love it when you say that. Yeah, I love this. And, you know, we've joked with the folks at OpenText, the biggest company you've never heard of, right? So let's hear about what they're doing. Although, Scott, I got to tell you, OpenText is a public company. They are in the Tequila Sunrise Supply Chain Tech Stock Index.
Outstanding.
So I feel like there might be one or two people who've learned about them from that.
Well, from doing my homework, the brightest people in the industry have heard of OpenText.
Yeah.
And we're looking forward to sharing kind of with some perspective, point of view, and Mark's story here momentarily. Quick programming note before we get started. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. All right, with no further ado, let's bring in our featured guest who's been waiting patiently here. Mark Morley, Director, Strategic Product Marketing with OpenText, the information company. Mark, good morning.
Hi, good morning. Thanks very much for inviting me to your show.
Yeah, welcome aboard.
We have really enjoyed our warm-up conversations and getting to know you better and all the many things that OpenText powers across the globe here lately. And we're looking forward to sharing that with our audience. So for starters, though, before we get into business and work and all that hard stuff, let's talk about Mark Morley. Let's talk about, you know, your background, where you're from, and give us a story or two, you know, from your upbringing.
Yeah, so I'm based in Reading in the UK, which is about 30 minutes west of London. My interest in supply chain really started out at school, funnily enough. So I'm very hands-on with the subjects with metalwork and woodwork and how things were made. And naturally, there's an evolution there to work out, well, where do the things come from to make those products? So that's really fired up my interest at that time. And then one day I was in a computer lesson, and our first computer that was brought into the school was wheeled in on a big trolley. And we had 30 colleagues of mine in the classroom trying to work out, well, how do we timeshare this one computer in the whole school to sort of explore computer programming? And that really got my interest in the area of software and programming at that time. So we're talking now about the mid-80s, which seems an age ago now. And even looking at punch cards, for example, you know, how can you develop routines on punch cards? But the problem we had there, of course, was waiting for 3 or 4 days to get the results back,
Right.
how those cards were programmed. So that really sparked my interest in the software industry way back at school.
So Mark, I got to ask you, do you recall what the computer was, the first computer you had?
Yeah, it was actually a UK-based computer called Research Machines 380Z.
Okay.
And it was a big black monolith of a computer that was wheeled around the school. And I think in those days, the UK government was trying to make sure that every school in the UK had at least one computer. And we're talking about 1983, 1984 at this time.
So. Apple IIe was one of the first that we used in school here in the States.
Yep.
And I can definitely relate, Mark, to your point, because in middle school, which is when I think we first started using them, we got like 5-minute turns, and those 5 minutes might be all you get all week, you know, because everyone has a chance. And you know, it's so interesting now. While we still have a lot of more work to do to make sure everyone has access to technology, it's still, I mean, just the proliferation of where it is everywhere, and you know, from your hand to the classroom to at home, it's amazing to think back to the environment in the 80s, computers on trolleys.
Yeah, around that time, my uncle had an Apple Lisa, which of course was one of the first computers to have a mouse at that time. And my grandfather bought me a Commodore VIC-20 back in 1983, and that really helped to accelerate my interest in the computer industry and where it was going. It was all computer games at that time, but I knew that was an area and industry that I wanted to get involved with. So.
Outstanding. Well, what one thing about, at those early ages where you're, looking at those pioneering devices, what one element really just grabbed hold and ensured that this is, you're going to be in the technology business?
I think I would say, honestly, it's about the automation, because at that time we were hearing stories around companies using robots on the production shop floor, for example. And today, when you're looking at Microsoft HoloLens and all these other devices, Google Glass, etc., there's a constant thread way back to the mid 80s where these technologies started to evolve. And I looked at some of the technologies when I was at university, and that sort of cemented my career in terms of where I wanted to focus, where I wanted to go to. So I've always had an interest in automation, which brings me right up to date with the current company that I work for.
Outstanding. We're going to talk about that momentarily. One final question. So you live in Reading now. Is that where you grew up?
No, I actually grew up on the East Kent coast in the UK, just north of a place called Dover, which is actually where I was born. And it's one of the world's busiest ferry ports. So from a travel logistics hub point of view, it's one of the busiest ferry ports in the world, actually. But I lived in a small town called Deal, just north of Dover. So I've always been near the coast. I've always enjoyed the sea. And here I am today in the middle of a tech corridor in Reading. And our office is based next to Oracle, HP, Microsoft, and some of the big leaders. So you could call it the sort of the Silicon Valley of the UK in terms of where I'm located today. So a good position to be in.
Outstanding. They're in Reading. All right. So Greg, let's dive into Mark's professional journey.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about what your career was like after high school, after college, whatever, all the way up to what you're doing today. I mean, tell us about any roles that were particularly nurtured the foundation that you built even in high school.
Yeah, sure. So the journey really started after school when I went to college, studied engineering, computer-aided engineering at that time, as you'd imagine. So combining my practical knowledge of making things with computers and software and bringing those two stories together. I did a master's degree in computer-aided engineering at Cranfield University in the UK.
Yeah.
So Cranfield, as you probably know, is a leading university for supply chain and logistics. So it's one of the top postgraduate universities in Europe. From there, I joined a company called Computer Vision. And this was all focused around software, 3D design software in the CAD/CAM market, computer-aided design and manufacture. I joined that company in 1992. And then the company was taken over by PTC, who are also one of the big players in the product lifecycle management space back in 1997. And at that time of the takeover, I wasn't sure where I was going to be going career-wise, journey-wise. So I took a bit of a career break. I actually left the industry as a whole and went to work for the McLaren Formula One team, the racing team.
Why not?
So yeah, my previous company, Computer Vision, had a sponsorship partnership deal with McLaren. We supplied the CAD engineering software in which they design their vehicles, their race cars.
Right. And
I joined McLaren to manage the technology partnerships for the particular team. However, I decided that it was a bit of a lifestyle career, and I was itching really to get back into technology. So I rejoined PTC in 1999. And I took on an international.
You were itching to get out of racing.
Yeah, I guess I was missing the technology piece. I love racing as a sport. I still follow Formula One and IndyCar now, but I was missing the hands-on with the technology, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I rejoined PTC, took on an international marketing role with that company, built out their network of demo centers for PTC to be able to showcase their design software in different locations. And then due to restructuring, I left that company in 2003. However, I just started an MBA, a personally funded MBA at that time at Warwick Business School. And then I joined my former company, GXS, back in 2006. And one interesting area is that while I was doing my MBA, I decided to do, for some reason, a dissertation looking at the space tourism industry. And when you think back to 2006, there was no industry. There were hardly any companies. So how do you do a research project on something that doesn't actually exist? So it's interesting times. It was looking at Virgin Galactic and where those companies were going for low Earth orbit satellite deployment and space tourism. And now roll forward 20 years, SpaceX and what they've achieved. I'm just starting to see these shoots of growth of what I originally looked at way back in 2006 from a research standpoint.
Well, Mark,
And
really
yes.
quick, why did you choose space tourism? What caused you to focus on that?
What were you thinking?
You're a trailblazer.
The reason for that was that one of the companies that PTC donated software to as part of their program was a company called Star Chaser Industries based in the UK. So they were a startup building rockets. They had a couple of rockets that they'd actually successfully launched from UK soil. And I got to know the CEO of that company fairly well. He wanted a business plan developing, a sponsorship program developed. And so I got to know him very well. And what I did was build my dissertation around that particular company. They're still going today. However, of course, companies such as Virgin Galactic and SpaceX have accelerated, the move around that particular industry. But for me, that got me an interest in industry marketing. So doing the research in the industry, what are the drivers? What are the pain points? And so when I joined GXS in 2006, I joined as automotive industry marketing director at that time. So looking at the trends, how do we develop solutions to target the automotive industry? And I was in that role for about 6 years before OpenText acquired GXS. And GXS, was a very well-known name in the supply chain sector. And it was acquired by OpenText. I hadn't even heard of OpenText when the company acquired GXS in 2014.
There you have it.
No, exactly.
Biggest company known.
Yeah, exactly. And today I'm a product marketing director with the company. So
You got your work cut out for you.
Yeah, it's worked out. And there's been a thread through my journey from school through university to where I am today, looking at global supply chains.
So, hey, quick comment, Greg. I know we're going to keep driving back to space. I'm a big space nerd, Mark, and this is not this is not an original thought, but I've heard others talk about, once we do establish a permanent presence on the moon or even Mars, however many years away, we complain now about global supply chains. Can you imagine that supply chain?
They're galactic.
Yeah,
right.
That's right.
Yeah, galactic supply chains. It's an interesting area, interesting discussion. We already hear about, I think there are US companies look at mining on the moon, for example. I mean, how do you get those goods in real time back to the UK? I mean, it's just a whole different area if that eventually takes off.
Well, I think you just kind of throw it and eventually hit. I know
Very technical engineering answer there, Greg.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So that's a very intentional path towards supply chain, with a brief stop in racing, which I have to say I'm a little envious about, but I recognize that it's not always good to make your vacation your vocation. So, but that's a really intentional path towards supply chain for how early you started, which is not earlier than I started, by the way, Mark. So,
yeah,
because there wasn't a lot of education there, and there weren't programs for supply chain specifically, or was there one at Cranfield then?
Yeah, Cranfield back in 2000. Let me think. Back in '93, I think it was, and even to the present day, there's a gentleman there, Professor Martin Christopher. He's one of the leading researchers at Cranfield in supply chain and logistics. You probably heard of him, and there are a couple of others there that are very well known in the supply chain space. However, I decided to sort of follow my interest from school around design, computer software. So yeah, I got to meet many of the supply chain professors at Cranfield, very respectable education facility. But my interest was still in the design side at that time.
Yeah.
And 3D CAD.
Yeah. So anyone in that stage of your life really stand out as a mentor or somebody who gave you that kind of aha moment that kind of helped you break through or find direction?
Yeah, I think there's, I think from a direction standpoint, there are many innovators out there, entrepreneurs. If you think of someone like James Dyson, for example, and the business that he's established, originally making Hoovers way back. and now to where they are today, where they wanted to build this electric vehicle, which unfortunately they've put on hold or cancelled altogether. But looking at someone like that who started up a business from scratch, designed innovative products, they've got to develop and design their sourcing strategy, admittedly from parts of the Far East as well. So looking at the global nature of what guys such as James Dyson did and others was sort of an inspiration for me that I wanted to emulate, but sort of follow their journey, if that makes sense, from a supply chain perspective.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk a little bit about where you are now, about OpenText, right? We've said it a couple times. It's a big company, right? I mean, it's over almost 3 billion. Is that right? Or
that's correct. Yeah. 3.1 billion, the latest revenues for the company.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us a little bit about how you landed there. I mean, you told us the company you were at got acquired, but how you wound up doing what you're doing. What does OpenText do? So if there's anybody who doesn't know, they can be clear on that. And then a little bit about what your role really means, right? The title often belies the activities of the day, right?
Yeah, so as you said, OpenText is a $3.1 billion company, Canadian, headquartered in Waterloo, just outside Toronto. And we are an information management company, started as a research project back in 1991 at the University of Waterloo, where 4 researchers, and in fact, the gentleman that was part of that project is still our chairman today, Tom Jenkins. And they looked at a project of how to digitize information way back then. So for example, how do you digitize the Oxford English Dictionary? How do you search for specific information within that huge volume of data and information and make that information meaningful across the business? And that established really our first search engine technology, which at that time was licensed to a young company back then called Yahoo. So our search engine technology actually helped to start off Yahoo's business, which was quite an interesting story back then. So you mentioned right at the beginning, one of the largest companies that people have probably never heard of, but to sort of establish other companies in that way was certainly quite interesting from a technology point of view. So we're focused on an area called information management. OpenText has been a very acquisitive company over the years, acquiring about 62, 63 companies in that time frame.
Wow.
And expanding it from the original area of content management, so managing any type of file, digital information moving across the business, into security, cyber resilience, digital asset management for videos and those kind of files. So they're really focused up until 2014 on managing documents within the enterprise. And it wasn't really until they acquired my company GXS in 2014 that they wanted to focus on the external enterprise and connecting and integrating the external ecosystem. And that's the division that I'm part of today called Business Network.
So GXS was EDI, and I assume other connectivity mechanisms, correct?
Yes. Yeah, so GXS was formed out of GE Information Services,
right?
Which was spun out, I think, in 2000 as Global Exchange Services. So there's a bit of history behind that company, setting up one of the world's first email systems for Microsoft and how they started their business back in the early days. But you're right. I mean, EDI is, it's technology that's been around since the 1960s. Everyone says there's new technology that's going to replace it. XML in 2000, even blockchain today, and it hasn't happened yet. So EDI is what I would regard as sort of the DNA of today's supply chains. It's there and moving information from one location to another electronically.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the days back in the 90s talking about 850s and 852s, right? Electronic PO records, electronic invoicing, electronic acknowledgement of receipt. And I recall being one of those people who thought, oh no, XML or whatever is going to replace it. But you know what? There is a certain staying power. And this is a good lesson, I think, for people to learn about technology. One, technology takes longer to implement than you expect. And two, which you've demonstrated in 2 cases. And 2, it lasts a lot longer if it's economically feasible. And that's why RFID sticks. And that's why EDI sticks, is because the economies of scale continue to grow as the product matures or as usage expands.
Well,
Exactly.
so if I could weigh in, I've learned something here. I've learned a big lesson learned here. I have been mispronouncing how to say Yahoo for 30 years.
That's the English.
Yeah,
That's English.
Hey, I love it. I love the difference.
It's my English accent, I guess, but
I love it. Yahoo. I love that. It's such a.
It sounds much cooler when you say it like that.
That's right.
No, and those are all important lessons. I have to go back to something you said, because this often, I'm going to say, I think this often confuses the audience. It doesn't confuse me, just to be clear, but it might confuse the audience. And that is, when you say document management or digital management, explain what the management part of that means, because I think that can be a really vague term, and I'm not sure that everybody, and I can tell you that I certainly don't understand, what the dynamics are.
The document management part of our business represents probably half of our revenue. It's a huge part of our business. And when we talk about document management, it's all about, should we say in high level terms, the archiving of information. So whether that's test reports, material specifications, digital videos to show how to disassemble a piece of equipment, for example, any type of digital document that's moving around the organization, that's updated, it's modified, it's changed, you need to be able to keep track of those modifications. And that's really what a document management system is doing. Now, whether that's just normal documents, as I said, or whether you're archiving video feeds, audio files, we have that ability to archive any type of digital information. And that's one half of our business. And I'll go on to explain more about what our business network does in a moment to sort of complement that.
Excellent. Well, ton of talk here lately about adaptive supply chains, especially, and it's been around, this notion's been around for years, but in 2020, you're like 2020, holy cow, is it ever, it's what everybody's after, right? So let's talk about what adaptive supply chains and how you define that. And let's talk about some of the things how OpenText is powering organizations to have adaptive supply chains.
Yeah, sure. So when you think of the word adaptive, and it's been top of mind actually with many supply chain and logistics leaders over the last few months with COVID-19, they've had to very quickly restructure supply chains. And also I would describe it as a black swan event with COVID-19, because supply chain leaders have got no choice. They've got to restructure supply chains. And in fact, I read a report yesterday where a UK manufacturer of, should we say, small widgets is actually onshoring their production from China back to the UK. And they've actually found it cheaper now to manufacture back in the UK than sourcing from China. So that ability to restructure the supply chain quickly based on various factors that may be impacting, whether it's disruption in the supply chain, for example. Companies have struggled over the years to not only restructure their supply chain, but restructure their back-end IT infrastructure to keep up. So that ability to sense when changes are required and feed that into some form of adaptive system, if you like, that focuses on a cloud-based environment to allow manufacturing anywhere, sourcing from anywhere, and essentially provide the flexibility that companies need, the ability to, as I said, manufacture, source anywhere, collaborate with trading partners anywhere in the world, being able to maintain visibility of shipments, whether it's using IoT data, for example, to know where the shipment is and the condition of the shipment, and then deriving insights. So taking those four pillars, if you like, flexibility, collaboration, visibility, and insights, taking those together, they sort of underpin some of the thought leadership and development work we're doing around this concept of the adaptive supply chain, being able to respond in more real time to current situations and how companies are being disrupted.
That's a really important concept, because there is such a huge blind spot whenever there is inventory in motion, right? We don't know exactly where the container is. We don't know exactly what stage it's at. I think of imports and I think of the possibility that falls off the ship. It never makes the ship. It gets stuck in customs, right? Or quarantined in customs, or it doesn't make the drayage drop, or whatever can happen. But if you can monitor that in real time, at the very least, you can know you've got a crisis coming before it hits. Yeah. And at the very best, you can identify alternative plans to say that one is stuck in an LTL depot and it's not going to get picked up till tomorrow. So we need to provision for fill in or substituting, different items for this one or whatever. I have having been a retailer, I have a particular soft spot for being able to see that. I remember, semis winding up in Mexico and finding out that the stuff was being sold off the back of the trailer. A guy who we literally had a driver who had a girlfriend in Reno, and they would get hammered for 4 days straight and the stuff would not show up.
Wow.
It sure would have been nice to know when something got off track or got delayed. And that the data and the technology is available to do that is critical. It was critical 20 years ago, but it's really critical now.
I like earlier in your answer, Mark, you were alluding to how leadership and the operation wants to go here, but the technology's got to be able to power that. And it seems like a portion of what you do and the OpenText team does is make sure that technology doesn't hinder the business from being able to take advantage of an opportunity.
Yeah.
But it helps power it and helps that leader or that leadership team or the operation sees the day and sees the opportunity, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And today we're all about providing that so-called digital foundation. So as I mentioned earlier on, OpenText, up until the GXS acquisition, focused on internal management of digital information. And with the acquisition of GXS, now OpenText provides integration solutions to the external supply chain. Now, we have made other acquisitions over the last 6 years, such as IoT solutions, identity and access management, and most recently, solutions that allow us to integrate with those internal enterprise systems. So it's all about building that digital foundation, that digital backbone that extends from the digital supply chain through the firewall into the enterprise, and being able to integrate seamlessly with SAP, for example, or Oracle, and then between different applications such as transport management systems. So that integration layer, I believe, is critical to underpinning future digital transformation projects and embracing all the new disruptive technologies that are out there today. And that's what we're about. Connect once, reach anything, integrating people, systems, and things across the supply chain.
Love that. There is no shortage of disruptive technologies out there. Good things, but how can all the technologies and the platforms and the apps all play nice in the sandbox? That seems to be a huge challenge these days. All right, so I want to shift over to the COVID-19 environment, but I want to make sure that we do adaptive supply chain right. So is there anything else that comes to mind around this notion of ensuring, empowering that your clients and their respective operations and organizations, they have supply chains that can adapt and evolve and flex? I like those 4 pillars you were talking about. Mm-hmm. Flexibility, collaboration, insights. What was that 4th one, Mark?
Visibility.
How can I forget that? Goodness gracious. Anything else
you
about
can't say supply chain without saying visibility or control towers?
That is right. Before we go over to the COVID-19, Mark, anything else that you'd like to add, examples or what have you, about adaptive supply chain?
Yeah, I think many companies struggle today on where do we start? And I think if you look at the pandemic and COVID-19, many companies are in a position where they've got to do something. COVID-19 is sort of forcing their hand. They have to change, and they won't know where to start. They may not have the resources internally to deploy solutions that improve flexibility, collaboration, etc., that I mentioned earlier on. So to that end, what we can do is help those companies. We can augment IT teams that may struggle to resource these new projects with something that we call managed services. So we undertake the integration on behalf of these companies. We have our own data center network worldwide. And for example, we can help companies digitize their supply chains, onboard their trading partners, and accelerate that digitization process, so that what we're trying to do really is better prepare them for the next disruption. So how can we leverage various integration technologies, visibility tools, IoT, for example, to provide the visibility and insight to almost predict what's going to happen to our business during the next disruption? And as I said, leveraging outside resources, augmenting those IT teams with technologies, people process technologies, is an ideal way to really help companies establish and evolve that adaptive supply chain.
So I'm curious, Mark, all that sounds really, like you said, companies don't know where to start. From your standpoint, what is an ideal size or type of customer? What is the market for products like yours?
Yeah, we work with many companies around the world. So as an example, Gartner puts out a top 25 list every year of the top supply chains. As an example, and that information is freely available, we currently power 21 of those 25 supply chains. They're all connected to our network. We're providing connectivity to whether it's a tier one automotive supplier, suppliers in the retail sector. So we focus primarily on retail, consumer goods, automotive, high tech, industrial and financial services, corporate to bank, for example. And we work with many sizes of companies. And as you can imagine, a big multinational with suppliers all over the world. We may have mum and pop shops based in outer China somewhere that just has an internet connection.
Right.
They just want to be able to type information into a web form. We take care of the back end conversion into an EDI transaction, so it removes that complexity from the really small supplier. And we get them on the first rung of the digital supply chain ladder, if that makes sense. And it all builds from there in terms of capabilities.
That's great. I think back to my sporting goods days and the hacky sack supplier, if anyone even remembers what a hacky sack is, that was literally making hacky sacks in his garage in Denver, Colorado. And we got him on EDI at the time. And it's good to see that there are still options for companies like that. As you said, to start on the first rung of the ladder, that's, the kind of happy meal of supply chain, if you will. Get them started, right? And then allow them to mature to the various levels. That is where efficiencies are made, as I'm sure you know, Mark, because there are so many small suppliers out there. Just getting them to do something is helpful and so critical to the business.
Well, they're looking for guidance in terms of where to go next, what type of technology to adopt. And yes, there are industry bodies out there, such as GS1 as a good example, deploying standards that any company can leverage in the retail CPG space, for example. And that helps to accelerate adoption at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Greg, we'll have to do an upcoming episode on the hacky sack supply chain. I think it's an intriguing.
Probably topic. Pretty light right now. You don't see people kicking them around campus anymore.
I'm gonna pose that question to my 3 kids and see if they even can fathom what that is.
Yeah.
All right. So you started to address a little bit, Mark, the COVID-19, the pandemic environment, and let's dive a little deeper on that. How have you seen your customers' needs shift, and to that end, how have you seen OpenText shape its value prop, its offerings, and its work to make sure these clients have what they need?
Yeah, so in terms of more broadly, if you think about every company today, they've got a challenge of how do we get employees back to work, and what kind of digital solutions can we provide to provide remote working if that's what companies want. So it's trying to find that fine balance of solutions that improve day-to-day collaboration. Whether you're using video conferencing tools, whether you're using collaboration portals, we have platforms that allow companies to collaborate and share files remotely, securely. But also tools that allow you to redline and mark up video files. Maybe you're part of the video and media industry, for example, but having tools there that improve that collaboration process. But even improving the security of the supply chain, improving cyber resilience and endpoints. That's more broadly what OpenText can provide today to help companies get employees back to work, whether that means working remotely. But then when you look on the supply chain side, how do you ensure that you can work seamlessly with suppliers through disruption? And many companies have been disrupted. I can't think of any other event over my career, for sure, where nearly every single global supply chain was almost shut down during March and April time. So how do you leverage technology to identify alternative suppliers, maybe as a dual sourcing strategy. So we have some technology called a global partner directory, for example. Think of it as a telephone directory of every supplier connected to our network. 1.2 million companies are connected to our business network globally. And we can leverage this telephone directory in essence to filter, to search for key suppliers we may want to work with. We've augmented it with information from Dun & Bradstreet and EcoVadis, who specialize in ethical sourcing solutions, for example. So we've been trying to help companies accelerate the onboarding of alternative suppliers. But to do that, they need to be digitized. They need to be connected. So we're seeing an increasing interest in cloud-based solutions today, and CIOs are very keen to divert budget to explore cloud-based integration solutions. And I think that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. I think today, now is cloud's moment. You know, it's going to accelerate the growth really quickly. So,
yeah, that's you shared a lot there. I'd like to dive into, but I think one of the big things, and Greg, we've talked about this extensively. You know, some companies are not going to go back to the office. They're going to remain a remote environment for a long time to come, if not permanently. And the technology and the secure technology behind that, I can only imagine some of the conversations you're having, Mark, because we've seen, you know, while plenty of smaller businesses are taking that, you know, let's go remote for the foreseeable future, there's also been some announcements of some really large organizations that are shutting down dozens of offices. So I bet you're having a ton of those conversations around not just to set up the technology to allow that to happen and productivity to happen, but happen securely in this ever challenging cyber environment.
Yeah, I mean, even taking OpenText ourselves, I mean, we made an announcement back in April time that we were going to close 50% of our offices because we found that we just didn't need, when the pandemic started back in March timeframe, 13,000 employees at OpenText went completely remote working. And apart from obviously some of the people working in our data centers that did need to be in the office, but nearly 13,000 employees working remotely, we decided to shut 50% of our offices. We didn't need the floor space. And we could prove that remote working works. Now, in terms of the solutions and areas I mentioned earlier on, improving the collaboration, visibility, that's what we do day in, day out. And if we can help companies accelerate that remote working or move to that remote working mentality, I think it's a game changer in terms of the type of technologies out there today. And, you know, we'll see, as I said, cloud maturing. If it hasn't matured enough already since 2010, when many companies started to talk about cloud, mobile, big data, 2010, everyone was talking about the technology. But I think, unfortunately, COVID-19 has accelerated the interest in those kinds of technologies.
Undoubtedly. I mean, you know, we've heard it, two things: one, cloud, and two, supply chain. It is those industries' moment because of this. I mean, you know, I've been in supply chain arguably for, let's say, more than 2 decades, around 2 decades. But you were in high school when I started in the supply chain industry, Mark. So it was only part-time then. But you know, if you think about the acceleration of need here, it's really because of the acceleration or the identification of these industries. Of this was such an incredible use case, business case for defining what supply chain is. I don't get asked the question anymore ever what supply chain is. And and in 2010, 2011, I had a cloud supply chain technology company of my own. I had to answer 2 questions just to get in the door. What is cloud and why would I ever do that? And 2, what is supply chain again?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is, if I think back to 2010, we saw this shift to the cloud. And one of the drivers back then was actually the earthquakes in Japan. So when you think of many of those Japanese companies with data centers around Tokyo, those earthquakes hit, that, you know, it impacts all of their global supply chains and production facilities.
Right.
And of course, many of those Japanese companies had behind the firewall software, legacy environments that couldn't grow, they couldn't expand, and they weren't adaptive, if that's the correct term, to the current situation. So we saw the growth in cloud around 2010. And I think, unfortunately, the pandemic is going to accelerate that probably 5, even 10-fold now. Companies don't move, they're going to get left behind. So,
Well, and as you said, automation is so much more important, and so many companies are moving towards it because of COVID-19, that the only way to power the expectations that you set earlier, the collaboration, the adaptability, all of that, the only way to power that is with a gigantic computer. And the only way to economically do that is to have a computer that you only pay when you're doing that heavy, heavy lifting. Otherwise, you put a $10 million computer in there that's used about 2% of the time.
yeah,
And you use it just to hit peak. And that is the value of cloud. And it also allows you to process the complex algorithms and relationships and integrations that are necessary to connect and adapt rapidly in the environment you're describing.
Mm. It helps you win chess games too, right?
Heard that.
All right. So Mark, a lot of what you just shared a moment ago, as you were kind of talking about the COVID-19 environment, a lot of those have universal application regardless of what environment we're in, based on where the world's going. Let's keep going down that trend, and let's really, take as you were talking, speak broadly. What else are you tracking right now? There's so much. I mean, gosh, it was tough in doing our homework for this conversation. It was so tough to go into all the different things that OpenText is doing. So I appreciate your willingness to kind of really focusing on where you're spending your time. But what else are you keeping your finger on the pulse of when you look at global supply chain in 2020 and beyond?
Yeah, there's two main areas that we're looking at the moment. And as I said right at the beginning, I get involved with a lot of thought leadership on behalf of the business unit that I work for with Business Network. And over the last 6 months, we've put quite a strong focus on ethical sourcing, for example, and sustainability, because it's top of mind with every CXO today, CEO. They want to know where the goods have come from, what are the constituent parts that go into making a product. Are they hopefully using conflict-free minerals, for example, as part of that sourcing process? So building out thought leadership around ethical sourcing is number one. And how, for example, when you think about our network, as one example, we are processing something like 26 billion transactions per year, electronic transactions across our network. If I think about the amount of paper, a number of trees we're saving as part of digitizing those supply chains, that equates to around 6 million trees, just by digitizing those paper-based information flows on our network. So indirectly, we're contributing towards developing more sustainable supply chains by digitizing that information. The second area I've been looking at is really the disruptive technologies. There's been a lot of talk about IoT, AI, blockchain. Mm-hmm. And when blockchain started to come onto the markets, probably about 3 years ago, I think from a supply chain perspective, many companies wanted to find out, well, what is blockchain? How can companies use it? And there was a lot of research done by the analyst firms such as Gartner and IDC about the individual technologies. So IoT, AI, blockchain. What they weren't really doing was thinking about what happens if you take that technology collectively. So for example, if you have IoT sensors connected to a shipment, you want to take that shipment information, the sensor device data, into maybe an AI and machine learning platform to discover insights. But what if you could actually archive that information into a blockchain as well, and then retain the provenance of the shipment as it moves through the supply chain? So I sort of developed thought leadership around that area. And one of the analysts I spoke with at IDC 3 years ago said that I was one of the first people that he had spoken to that sort of discussed these technologies collectively as part of what we defined back then as the autonomous supply chain. So I know there are many different supply chain definitions, from adaptive, ethical supply chain, and now autonomous supply chain. Mm-hmm. But I think the autonomous supply chain really embraces those new technologies. And really it provided a platform for us to talk about blockchain. Even though OpenText has many solutions, we don't have a blockchain solution per se at the moment, but we're exploring partnerships. We're keeping an arm's length on the technology because there's a lot of hype still around it. But we know that the number one use case for blockchain at the moment is around track and trace, provenance of goods. And there's no end of examples that companies have been sharing with media analysts. And I'm sure you've had conversations as well.
Oh, yeah.
So we're just keeping our finger on the pulse, looking at what's going on. And as I said, I'm having many customer meetings about the technology with enterprise architects. They want to get our point of view. Where do we think the technology is going? Is it going to replace EDI? I always say no, it's complementary technology. So that's really our talking point of thought leadership over the last few months.
Okay, Greg, there's so much there to dive into, but what's one thing that really stands out in what Mark shared?
Oh, I think the thing that stands out is that we are finding what to do with these technologies, right? IoT, I think one of the biggest values of IoT is it's a predictive technology. It can tell you, for instance, that the flux capacitor is out of tolerance and it's about time to replace it, right? With blockchain, it is an immutable and unchangeable record. It is a verification, an electronic verification of trust is essentially what it is. So you can verify, for instance, as Mark said, if you're talking about EDI and that in combination, you can verify this is the PO that I received. This is the invoice that I issued against it. This is the shipping manifest that I've produced. This better be what's on the truck. And the blockchain can verify that hasn't been altered, can verify that it ties back to the original documents, and it can be verified at every step, because there are opportunities for, let's be generous and say failure in the supply chain at every step. I mean, you can verify, and they're doing this now, right? They're verifying which fishermen in Indonesia caught this fish and which boat they were on. And I mean, they're even doing that in those kind of markets and following that provenance, as he said, all the way through the supply chain. If you think about it, I love this example. One of the most counterfeited products in the world is olive oil. And supply chain would be a great model for that, to make sure that we're getting olive oil, to make sure that we know which tree it came from. And the cannabis industry is a great example of that, because track and trace is such an important part of it. You know what soils were used, what amendments were used, what fertilizers were used, etc. And you have to keep track of every aspect of the plant. So all of those things become really meaningful. And as we talk about autonomous supply chain, we talk about real-time visibility, blockchain is a great communicative device and a great verification that what you're seeing is the truth.
Yeah, and I liked your reference to the flux capacitor, because it got me thinking about the DeLorean.
That's right.
And also, when you think of the title of that film, Back to the Future, we're thinking of EDI technology that's 50 years old now.
Yeah.
Right.
Had its 50th birthday last year. And now we're sort of augmenting EDI technology with IoT, with AI, with blockchain. So it's sort of foundational to everything that goes on today with supply chain. So I thought I better reference that, because I thought it was a nice quote there you gave, the flux capacitor.
That's the only part I could think of in the moment.
What's old is new
I've been
again.
watching too much Netflix.
Well, speaking of Netflix, there's a great DeLorean documentary on Netflix about that whole story. It's fascinating.
I've seen it. It's very good.
It really is.
Yeah.
All right. So enough about flux capacitors and Back to the Future. I love that reference. So, all right. So, Mark, sidebar question with cold chain and its explosion. Greg, you and I have tackled that industry here in recent weeks and talking about some of the acquisitions and the movements, and certainly what's on the horizon for cold chain, whether it's vaccine related or, food, produce, all the different things that are pushed through a very controlled environment. Mark, is that a space that you and a lot of your work, are y'all deeply involved in cold chain?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we work not just with large food manufacturers, as you'd expect, consumer goods manufacturers, but also pharmaceutical companies. So again, I guess using that provenance example of blockchain, I had a discussion with an enterprise architect at a pharmaceutical company probably a month ago now, wanting to understand more about blockchain, how it can be used in that context, but also IoT. So how can they track the raw ingredients that go into those medicines, not only for tracking purposes, but also for preventing counterfeit medicines entering the supply chain as well. and we know there's no end of counterfeit goods out there in the market.
Right.
So anything that we can do to leverage integration technologies, visibility solutions to secure the supply chain in a better way. And I think that's where blockchain will have its moment in the future. But as I said, underpinning that is the integration capabilities. If companies have not got a digital supply chain, they're going to find it really difficult to embrace these new disruptive technologies.
Well put. Good stuff there.
No doubt.
All right, Greg, I tell you, Mark gets our juices going. I mean, all the different aspects of the technology equation that companies are trying to solve these days. It seems like Mark's got a pinky here or an index finger there. He's involved in all of it. It's really fascinating.
You got to keep your finger on the market. So,
That's right. Well, as the only non-technologist in this conversation, I'm glad there's smart folks like Greg and Mark that are making that kind of stuff happen. All right, so Mark, we're looking forward to. We've got a live stream with you on the equation where our audience is going to be able to ask you some questions and pose their observations. That's going
to be live in all capital letters. I guarantee we are going to get a ton of questions around this.
Absolutely. I'm with you. I think it's going to be an outstanding conversation with our audience. And then, of course, we've got a webinar on the docket as well. But, Mark, let's make sure that our audience knows how to connect with you and learn more about OpenText. So what's the best way?
Yeah, so firstly, we have a couple of websites. OpenText.com is our main website to learn more about OpenText and our solutions for the broader information management capabilities. My division, Business Network. So if anyone's interested on how to digitize the ecosystem, both internally and externally, you can take a look at businessnetwork.opentext.com. And if anyone's interested in following me on LinkedIn or Twitter, I'm certainly on there as well. And I do try and post a lot of informative information around supply chain. I know you guys have liked quite a few of the posts on there, which has been great. So yeah, anything that happens in supply chain, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or follow me on Twitter. And hopefully I can provide you with some valuable insights.
I am very confident that
you
can.
I have no doubt that there will be valuable insights.
Well, hopefully our audiences enjoy this conversation as much as Greg and I have with Mark Morley, Director, Strategic Product Marketing with OpenText. I love the tagline, the information company. Mark, thanks so much, and looking forward to reconnecting with you probably in the next few weeks.
Great.
Greg, I loved this conversation. I mean, I had to pull back at times because 60 minutes doesn't go far. What was your favorite part?
My favorite part was the way he says provenance. No, honestly, I had my discovery moment early in this session, and that was, as Mark talked about, his learnings in high school and discussions around other technologies that we thought were going to take over. I mean, if you think about it, Mark was in school when the book 1984, which was written in 1949, actually came into being, and a lot of the automation that he was being told about, and we were all being told about then, still had not come into being and wouldn't come into being for decades. And I think that's a great lesson for us to learn, is things like, it's been a great and humbling lesson for me to learn around some of the things I mentioned, like XML displacing EDI and things like that. It takes a long time, and economics are critical to the longevity of technologies, even if they are perceived as old. Because when things get old, let's call it mature, the cost effectiveness becomes so compelling that people figure out ways to do it. And we talked about RFID, and of course, now I've forgotten what it's called, EDI, right? But the beautiful thing that I think OpenText is doing is they've recognized that, the economics of that, and they've augmented it with other technologies and integrative data between enterprises. And that is so important today. And that's critical to the success. So we're using the economical and effective, and we're using the visionary and forward looking to combine to create a better supply chain. And in this day, when two things to me stand out: one, security. We just barely talked about security, but security is a big gap in supply chain, because that mom and pop, that guy making hacky sacks in his garage, that's the person that could bring down Target or whomever, right? That with a breach because of lack of security. So a sort of overarching security technology is fantastic, as well as creating that connection between enterprises. So there's just so much here. Mark, he loves the design of it. I know that you're continuing to envision the future and make things continue to meet the growing and rapidly, as you said, changing needs of the industry. So it's really cool stuff. It's hard to think about data.
Yes.
And think it could be exciting, but it is, because it is changing things for the way the supply chain is done. And it's bringing supply chain into the future today.
Absolutely. Making it adaptive, of course.
Yep.
It is an invigorating discussion, hopefully, to our audience. Hopefully you enjoyed it as much as we did. There's so much to take away from this first conversation with Mark Morley. So on that note, you can check out all of our programming at supplychainnowradio.com. If you enjoyed this conversation, hey, find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. Check out our upcoming live streams, because we've got some hot ones coming up, and we want to hear from you, our audience. But on that note, we want to challenge you, hey, do good, give forward, be the change that's needed. And on that note, we'll see you next time here on Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.